If you are writing a memoir and you have your audience in mind, that is amazing. You know you need that. If you are going to really deeply connect with readers, share your truth, and invite them into that space with you, you absolutely must know who they are, what they like, what kinds of things are going to resonate with them. But sometimes authors take this just a step too far, and it is one of the biggest mistakes that I see with first time authors. Stay tuned because today I want to talk about trusting your readers.
You want to know the biggest reason that first-time memoirists fail to finish their book? Is they don't have a plan. And that is why my team at Page and Podium has put together an absolutely free resource called the Memoir Method Checklist. It is going to take you all the way through from that very first seed of an idea all the way to when you get to hold that beautiful book in your hands. You can download this resource right now at pageandpodium.com/checklist and get started making your plan so you can be sure you're one of the lucky ones that finishes and holds that book. Happy writing.
As a first time author, readers are some of the scariest people around. We have so many fears about how they're going to react. Are they going to hate it? Are they going to leave a terrible review? Are they going to reach out and bully us? What are they going to do? Now, of course, all of this comes from the opposite side, which is what I prefer to think about, which is that your readers are actually reading because they want to love your book. No one has ever in the history of the world bought a book that they hadn't heard of just because they hoped they would hate it, right? And yet, I know these fears are so persistent because they feel so real, especially the more we get into this internet age and this problem of anonymity, and people can be really mean on the internet. It's very easy to imagine that they're going to come at you with that same energy. The good news is I have not really seen that happen. So you can kind of rest assured that you will probably be fine depending on your topic, but probably. But there is one thing that will make readers really angry, particularly if you are aiming for what I call the NPR crowd, which many of our followers are. This a little bit more educated reader who is really up to date on current events, politics. They really want to understand the world around them. These people do tend to like memoir and other nonfiction because they're so curious about the world. But the mistake that is going to hurt you with that crowd, and by the way, many other readers, is if you do not trust them. So, what I mean by this is if you are going into your book thinking, you know what, my reader is not going to pick up on my nuances, or they're not going to get my theme, they're not going to, understand my vocabulary, those kinds of things can be the kiss of death to writing a confident memoir that people will really connect with. So today I want to talk about, first of all, why you, as an author who are understandably probably a little bit nervous about reception, need to be thinking about whether you trust your reader and how. And then I want to give you some examples of the ways that this lack of trust can show up, sabotage your book, undercut your confidence as a writer, and really just be a bad situation in general. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about why this is a problem. Now, depending on what types of books you like to read, and I hope you're reading memoir if you're writing a memoir, depending on what types of books you like to read, you probably are familiar with the experience of kind of going through a whole plot and discovering these kind of little breadcrumbs of things that are happening and figuring out that solution just the split second before the protagonist does, right? If you like to read mysteries or thrillers or that type of book, that is just the most delicious piece of that genre, is that you will be able to, based on the scenes that they are giving you, you will usually be able to kind of put together what's coming, but not way in advance, right? Just like I said, a page before, half a page before, right at the moment is the best, right? You put it together, you say, oh my gosh, you got to finish that book, right? Well, here's the thing. Even though you probably aren't thinking of your memoir as a mystery or as a thriller, maybe you are, I think most people don't, you are leading your reader on a journey in the same way that Stephen King or James Patterson is, right? You are still taking your reader down this path one step at a time. You're dropping breadcrumbs. It's just that the mystery that you're going to be revealing is not, a whodunit. Rather, it's how you made sense of what you experienced. So we want to be able to see you just parcel that out, just little by little, right? I think in the past I have talked about one of my very favorite contemporary memoirs, which is called What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. This book is excellent if you are curious about complex trauma, CPTSD. This is absolutely worth a read. It is an excellent example of a hybrid memoir that is pulling in research and expert kind of opinions and voices, along with her very compelling, very moving story. But that book is an excellent example of what I'm getting at here, because she is going through her childhood and just giving us little bits of kind of what she experienced. She intersperses it with what she's kind of doing as an adult, kind of reflecting back. But what that book does, this is an excellent device, is that as she is going through, she finds a therapist who is willing to work with her and kind of go on record, so to speak, for this book, so that the therapist actually becomes a character. And what is so brilliant about that is, if you have ever been in therapy, if you're writing a memoir, you should be. If you've ever been in therapy, you know that the way you make these discoveries about yourself is exactly the way I just described the reader journey. You are learning a little bit here and a little bit there and a little more, and then this breadcrumb comes in, and then you're back to this part, and then you're over here, and suddenly the puzzle pieces come together and you understand everything about that situation that you've been through, right? That doesn't mean that we're healed, but that quest for understanding, that is one of the absolute most human things there is. And when we invite our reader into that, it is thrilling. It's so exciting, and we really learn that way, right? If you think about how you learned in elementary school and high school, it is little by little, and then we build those blocks together, we scaffold our new information. So that is really the ideal. But I also want to talk about kind of the other side of that, which is very, very common in first drafts of all types of writers, no matter how experienced. It's common in first drafts, but it is particularly common in first-time writers, particularly if you are like a higher education type person, right? You've gone to college, probably some grad school. This is very common. And what I see is a drastic level of over-explaining. So what I mean by that is that rather than just kind of giving us a scene, letting us kind of see what happened, then the next scene comes along, we see you kind of act a little differently, we're putting together these pieces, is that the instinct is to say, here is what happened, here's the scene, and here's what it means. And so we'll see, for example, we're going to see this, story of someone having childhood trauma. So maybe this is what happens in Fu's book, right? Is we're going to maybe see this really abusive scene with her mother. After we get to the end of that scene, Fu just moves us on to the next thing, right? It's, in fact, a lot of times the most dramatic scenes will end a chapter. What I a lot of times see the instinct from first-time authors is to really explain what that meant. So we see this abusive scene, and in many cases it is very, very clear that it was abuse, right? But then the author will want to say, this was so harmful to me. I really never got over this, and it stuck with me for years and years. That is true. It did, right? That's why you're writing about it. And we are going to see that as we continue to read. We're going to see how that scene continued to shape you, continued to, hurt your sense of self or your self-confidence or whatever the result was on your mind. So we do not need to explain that, right? Now, it would be easy, I think, to say like, well, okay, but that doesn't matter. It's really important to me that this is clear. So I'm going to leave it in there. There still will be discoveries, but I just want to really make sure the person knows. Here's what I want to tell you. Whenever I see, when I'm just reading, just as a reader, whenever I see that there's that over-explaining, it signals to me, just instinctively, that that is where that author is insecure. I know you don't want that. That's why I'm sharing this, is that when we see over explaining, what we see is a lack of confidence. Now, let me give you kind of an example of this that's not book related, just kind of generally related. Think about the last time you had an issue and you went to someone that you really, really trust, someone that you knew would have the wisdom to kind of help you through that, give you a reframe, help you think about it differently. You went to them. You gave them all of these details, you poured out your heart. You said, "Oh, here's what's happening. Here's my problem. I don't know what to do." Did they stand up and bloviate to you about all of the things that they have learned and their experience that was similar? And oh my gosh, yeah, they've been through that and yours isn't even that bad. If they did, I bet you didn't love it. But more often, what is the case is that the people that we go to for that type of advice and that type of wisdom, instead, they will listen to us, they'll let us get it all out, then they will sit there thoughtfully for a second, and then they will say, here's how I think you need to think about it. Calmly and confidently, they will explain what they are saying and put a period at the end. Because that is not about them. That is about you. You are getting the advice. So now I want you to think about putting yourself in the seat of that mentor, right? Because that is effectively what you're doing. You are telling your story, but you are not the person telling the story to get the advice. You are the person telling the story to give the advice. So the best thing you can do for your reader is really demonstrate that you are measured and thoughtful. This is, by the way, why you need an editor, but that you are measured and you're thoughtful and you are giving just the exact amount of information, the exact amount of wording that they need to understand. You're not going to overdo it. You're not going to beat them over the head with it. You're not going to kick a dead horse. You are just going to give them what they need so that they can move forward with their life a little bit wiser, with a little bit more borrowed experience under their belt. So that is, friends, the reason that I am so passionate about making sure that you are not over-explaining in your work. Now, I want to give you the rest of this video. I want to give you a few examples of times when this over-explaining can happen. And by the way, it can happen to all of us. This is not meant to be judgmental. All of us have this because we have this need to be understood. That's why we're writing a memoir, right? I want to give you some examples of things that will scream to your reader, "I do not trust you. I do not think you're getting what I'm saying," and that will really ultimately turn your reader off and make you look a lot less confident about the message that you're trying to get across. Okay, so the first and the absolute most common place I see this, as I said earlier, is over-explaining scenes. Now, you may know that I have a fraught relationship with the advice to show, not tell. If you're not familiar with that advice, the idea is that rather than kind of explaining a scene, you just write the scene, right? So oftentimes this will be dialogue. It doesn't necessarily have to be dialogue, but it's going to be the same sort of formatting, right? We're going to see what the person was saying or what kinds of things they were saying. We're going to see your reaction. We want to probably have a little bit of, scene detail. What kinds of expressions were on the faces of the people that were there? What were you wearing? What did it smell like? What did you hear around you? What did you see around you? All these kind of details, they need to go in there because what we're doing is painting a picture. We're helping the reader to just step back. We want them to forget that we're there, right? We want them to get just really immersed in that book. So by just painting that picture of what is happening in the scene, we're offering it to them, we're showing them, rather than, telling them what it means, rather than going through the whole scene and then saying, oh, and then, and I just want to make sure everybody gets the idea that what I was doing, da 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 da. We're going to leave it at the scene, and then we're going to trust that as we move forward, we are making connections for the reader. Now, what I am not saying here is that you can only show. That is not true, and that is my issue actually with the advice to show, don't tell, is that I find it is too often taken so literally and so universally that we never ever can tell. That is simply not the truth. But here's what you want to think about. Are you explaining to the reader what they should think? Or are you explaining to the reader what you felt, but what couldn't be seen in the scene? right? A scene is what the camera captures, but one thing that really matters in memoir that the camera could not capture is what's going on inside of you. That is what we call a sequel. It usually follows a scene. We've got our scene, and then we're going to give the sequel where we're going to reflect, we're going to resolve, we're going to just move the story forward. That's not the same as telling. Telling is where you try to control the way that your reader took that scene. It will backfire every single time. So we want to make sure that you are not talking to the reader and telling them what to do. Rather, you are sharing yourself and inviting them into communion with you. That's what we're trying to do in memoir, right? So the first one is with our scenes and our sequels, this over-explaining. Really, it is fine, by the way, if in your first draft you do include some telling and what you want the reader. That can actually be really helpful later so that you can kind of see what you were getting at when you're revising. But that needs to be cut before it ever goes to an editor. The editor will probably cut it, but you want to cut it first because you want to really make sure that none of that telling, none of that kind of over explaining is going to go into your book. Okay, the second place that I really see this kind of lack of trust in your reader show up is just through vocabulary. So I have seen this a lot in ghostwriting clients where, we're aiming for a very particular voice. We want it to be a little bit more intellectual, maybe a little bit more elevated. Well, sometimes that means that we will include, a word that might not be an everyday word. So one example that I think of, this is from a few years ago. This author wanted to describe this person who was like not a really great person, but they had a particular body type. They had just like a little bit of a belly, right? So we were going to use the word paunchy. If you're familiar with this word paunch, that just means kind of a little bit of a belly. And we used that word. And as we were kind of going back through, as we were revising, the author was like, I really think we've got to define what that word means. Here's the thing. If you were writing for, elementary school children, absolutely. Middle school children, absolutely. If you are writing for, again, as I said, this kind of a little bit more educated audience or an NPR audience that is really interested in learning, which is what I recommend because for nonfiction, that's really who you're going to get. Defining words is going to drive them nuts. That crowd, first of all, they're perfectly capable of figuring out what the word means based on the context clues. But second of all, they can look it up, right? If they don't know it. When you define it for them, you are basically saying, I don't think that you know this word that I know. And it's not a really good look, right? We don't want to do that when we're, just using regular vocabulary. The exception, of course, would be if you're using some sort of expertise-based vocabulary. So I used the term complex PTSD earlier. If you're going to use that in your book, absolutely define that because, first of all, it's a little bit newer term. But second of all, that is a specialist term, right? Your reader probably came to your book to learn about that. So your definition is going to be really helpful. But just, if something is just kind of a little bit more kind of unique of a word, we don't need to define that for our reader. And the other piece here is that if you do, your copy editor will let you know. So then you can plug it in if you need to, or even just trade out a different word. But what we don't want to do is be over explaining and over analyzing and overdoing all of the explanation. Okay, the third thing that I see has to do with your timeline. So this is way more understandable because it is really difficult to lay out your memoir in a way that's going to explain what you're trying to get at without you having to explain what you're trying to get at, right? We have to be really intentional with the structure and the build and the growth and the climax. We do all this, by the way, in one-on-one coaching in our group coaching program, the Memoir Method. So if you are interested in learning the way that we approach this, check out our website, apply to join that program. I would love to see you there. But if you aren't working with that framework, you are kind of just flying blind, right? You're trying to figure out how you're going to explain by showing. What you do not want to do is make these symbolic connections for your reader. Let me explain what I mean. Let's say that you are writing a book where you escaped from something that was really, really difficult. We did a book like this a few years ago, and the women in the book really had an affinity to birds, like the symbolism of birds and flying away. So there were lots of places in this manuscript where birds came up. I actually loved it. I thought it was beautiful. For example, she's riding in a car and this bird kind of swoops in front and she sees this and she kind of thinks of herself as this bird. Or there's a character in there that kind of gives her this nickname of a little bird. It's quite charming as a device to pull a symbol through like that. But it is only charming if you let the reader figure that out yourself, right? What we do not want to do in that example is we don't want to get to where the other character is giving you this nickname of this little bird, and then you're like, oh, it was what I remembered right then was that bird that swooped in front of the car on the first day I was. Which, of course, now that is a non-nuanced example. When I say that, I know y'all are probably rolling your eyes at me. But I do think this is worth thinking about because there is such a temptation when you are so proud of the artistry and the symbolism, which you should be. There's such a temptation to just make so certain that your reader doesn't miss it. But if you make certain your reader doesn't miss it, what you are doing is robbing them of the power of that symbolism. Because the way that we fall in love with symbolism is not that the author tells us to love it, is that the author presents it to us. And we can take it or leave it. We can make it our own. And as the reader, we get to discover that, right? That is the joy of reading, is the discovery and the curiosity and the figuring out. So we don't want to, be thinking about this timeline and figuring out how we can explain our symbolism. We just want to place it very intentionally at the specific points in our memoir. We have 3 points that we really emphasize in the memoir method. We want to make sure that we are emphasizing it kind of around those turning points so that those points where we are making adjustments are really closely linked in with that symbolism. If you do that, your reader is going to get it. You do not need to over-explain. So those are really the top 3 ways that I see authors falling into this trap of over-explanation and not trusting your reader. If you can avoid those, you will be just fine with this. What I find though is just that people haven't really ever thought about it. So I want to put that on your radar. Remember, as you're moving forward, that thinking about your audience is exactly the right thing. It is what you should be doing. But when you think about your audience, don't think about what you want them to take away. Trust me, you cannot control them. They are going to take it the way they want to take it. Instead, what you need to be thinking about is what their experience of reading your book will be. And trust me, every audience wants to feel that they are co-creating this world with you, that they are discovering alongside you your experiences. That's really hard because those experiences are so personal and they're so intimate and they are ours. Often when we're writing a memoir, part of the reason is to reclaim those experiences as our experiences. When you write a memoir, you are actually sharing them. You are bringing people in. So as you're thinking about your reader, think about the discoveries that they can make and help guide them through those discoveries in a way that doesn't feel intrusive, in a way that just feels like the very best mentor. Like you're stepping back, you're sharing a bit of wisdom, and then you're putting a period on the end and trusting that reader to do what you hope they will do with your book, which I imagine is learn a little something and change a little something about how they see the world. Okay, I know that what you are going to put together is going to be amazing, and I am so excited to see with this editing eye how you can kind of pull out some of that over-explanation and make your book that much richer and that much more engaging. So reach out if we can help. I would love to support you, and otherwise, happy writing!
Writing your memoir can be one of the most rewarding, fulfilling, beneficial tasks that you can take on in this lifetime. But unfortunately, it can also be kind of a slog, especially if you don't know how to plan your time. And that is why my team has put together an absolutely free resource called the Memoir Method Checklist. This checklist is going to take you through every single step you need from that very first seed of an idea all the way through publishing that book and holding it in your hands. We're going to give you the steps, we're going to give you the timeline, and we are going to make sure that you always know where you're going, even a step before you get there. You can download this resource for free at pageandpodium.com/checklist. And once you do, let me know what you think. I would love to hear from you, hear about your book, and hear about how your writing is going.